For the Design Computation Input Output Conference 2021, we have the privilege to have an opening keynote from Dr. Theodoris Piropoulos. Dr. Theodoris Spyropoulos is an artist, architect, and educator. He is the director of the Architecture Association's world-renowned Design Research Lab, AADRL, in London, and a resident artist at Somerset House. Theodore has previously chaired the AA Graduate School, was professor of architecture at the Staatsschule in Frankfurt, and has been a visiting research fellow at MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies. He co-founded the experimental art, architecture, and design practice Minima Forms, and the work of Minima Forms has been acquired by international art and architecture collections that include the FRAC Center, the Sigmund Foundation, and the Archigram Archive, and has been exhibited at the MoMA in New York City, the Barbican, the Onassis Cultural Center, Somerset House, Detroit Institute of Art, and the Leonardo da Vinci Museum of Science and Technology, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts here in London. So it's a privilege to have Theo here with us today and to see what he has been up to in his research at the DRL. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Abel and Leo and the team. I think it's very important to have kind of platforms to be able to share and to communicate some ideas. I think the ideas that I want to kind of maybe contribute to the conference in a talk that I've titled Intelligence and Autonomy, Notes on the Artificial, are primarily kind of predicated on trying to explore certain strategies in terms of how we consider intelligence and how that is somehow worked on between computational frameworks and design platforms. And this kind of evolving history has had a long-standing relationship, I think, in the ways that we problematize the role of computation within design, from experiments like the architecture machine group that was part of, I think, a paradigmic moment in time that was evolving with the questions of the role of the architect, computational tools, and also a kind of changing move in this kind of evolution to what became known as the Media Lab. And some of those kind of profound questions that were being explored at the lab, let's say at MIT, for example, learning processes, the way children are working and thinking through things, and the research of Seymour Papert and Minsky and others, I think is part of the way that one can consider maybe some of those early kind of pioneering experiments and some of the ones that were more profoundly within architecture as thought experiments with, I think, a certain aspect of considering the role of the observer and possibly a definition of intelligence, which I ascribe to, which is that intelligence is not a product or an attribute of a thing, but it's really about the relationship between things. And those kind of elements, I think, find themselves primarily at play when we start to look at the role that computation has and the ways that we conceptualize, think through the problems, try to realize in the world today. And I take a kind of provocation starting point, for example, from people like Hans Hollein, who basically spoke to the fact that a true architecture of a time will have to redefine itself and expand its means, and many areas outside of traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as well as architects and architecture having to enter new domains. He basically spoke to the fact that everything was architecture and all are architects. It was a kind of almost a sensibility that kind of followed maybe in some of the experiments of precursors like the Media Lab and others like the Architecture Machine Group in that instance, which was speaking about that everybody's an observer in and of the world. And those kind of aspects of thinking about things is that the relationship or the new forms of communication are very much being problematized with our relationship to the computer. And I think profoundly that has an influence in the ways that we also think about automation or artificial systems and how they sort of operate. And potentially, at least from this perspective's talk, we will not be focusing on this form of concepts of automation, but we'll be looking at a kind of aspect of agency, which I think is a very important thing. Relationships between human and non-human, I think, are vital. So we could consider an evolving kind of relationship between human and human, human and machines with other machines. The context with a lot of the research that I develop with my colleagues in the design research lab or in my studio with Minimaforms, in this case is very much foregrounded thinking beyond building in terms of a fixed and finite kind of approach to thinking about things, introducing aspects of mobility, adaptability and evolutionary processes, but also looking at the evolving kind of human tendencies that we have with systems that have lifelike attributes, and a relationship of shifting from models of representation into more prototypical means of kind of exploring both in the digital and in the analog kind of experimentation, I think is profound. Because I think it opens up, I think, very humanistic aspects of the ways that we relate to non-human kind of agents. And in my work in different capacities, that's taken, I think, many different forms. A project like Petting Zoo, in some sense, was about trying to kind of shift the conversation of robotics into more emotive and sensorial means of how we live with things that actually have agency and can kind of interact with us. And the relationship of seeing these kind of more profoundly human aspects, of seeing these kind of emotive characteristics in these tendencies of these evolving relationships, I think afford kind of possibilities for us to kind of consider relative to the way that we think about the design space for some of these systems. Understanding that these systems themselves have a way of seeing and acting in the world, and those relationships with us are things that potentially could evolve into different ways of enabling curiosity, speculation, but also more participatory strategies. So a lot of the work, at least in some ways, is an attempt to kind of intervene within the public domain and make kind of accessible through kind of real world experiences of how people can kind of interact. Complementing that, I think the issue of its materialization in the world is very important, and to see material as something that goes through life cycles and also has animate characteristics is important when we consider design computation beyond, excuse me, let's say the digital platform. And to see how programmable materials and thinking through different kinds of design search spaces allow us and afford us maybe different ways of thinking about how we can embed intelligence in things. One of the things that's been a kind of ongoing preoccupation over the last 10 years and is going to be formalized in a book called Behaviors that's going to be released in the new year is this idea of thinking about architecture that is basically rejecting the kind of idea of a master plan or the blueprint, and is really more about designing a kind of open framework that really is trying to be able to problematize and create space. So some of our attempts has been really about exploring these kind of more agent-based systems or generative-based systems that have the capacity to really create maybe more high-resolution concepts of thinking about more animate building blocks for creating space. So here, for example, these agent-based kind of 3x3 cube robots are kind of soft systems that have the capacity to come together and basically have a taxonomy of kind of body plans for mobility, but at the same time be able to somehow develop maybe more goal-oriented kind of strategies of how we sort of create space. So the idea is to somehow embed within architecture the capacity for it to really engage in more conversational approaches, not only within itself as a kind of system in terms of how it somehow generates goals, but in a way also to understand that those relationships can be in dialogue to occupation and to other kind of observable means. So a lot of the research has been, I think, really looking at these kind of building blocks that have at least two states in the system on a unitary level, but really are sort of trying to exhibit more emergent kind of strategies of how they kind of interact with each other and how these goals are somehow emergent. So this prototype called Hypercell, for example, basically takes two kind of states. One is a cubic state as a kind of more structural voxel-like tendency, and the spherical state as a more mobile kind of strategy, and is trying to complement that with a kind of shape tweening between a sphere and a cube to introduce kind of a stable state and a mobile state as a kind of prototype. So you see these in some sense as operable kind of voxels in the world. And a lot of the research that we're doing is in terms of trying to see how these kind of elements can somehow be enabled and what are the kind of terms of those engagements. And a lot of the things are starting off with, I think, very kind of primitive means of actually seeing what self-organization and kind of co-participatory strategies of interaction could mean at the level of the actual agent development. And then trying to develop kind of more proof of concepts in terms of how those things can be actuated and let's call it more computer controlled. And those logics in some sense are very much kind of given magnitudes of complexity through computational platforms that can really start to deal with how these higher resolution rule-based systems can kind of co-evolve, and how those aspects of thinking about architecture and really somehow exploring that in ways that are much more autonomous can somehow be embedded in the system. So for example, in this case, this particular system was trying to problematize the aspect of having no kind of scaffolding, using the body plan and its ability to be adaptive through combinatorial strategies as a way of kind of exploring how these things could evaluate their performance relative to their organizations collectively and then be in a process to redistribute. So for example, the goal of going vertical could kind of imagine a certain kind of strategy of exploring those rule base for a column, or a collective kind of more migratory strategy in terms of really kind of exploring the relationship of time and duration could start to manifest themselves in different ways in terms of how these organizations are finding, in some sense, a form of computational form, either through pieces of furniture or architectural elements to kind of more full-scale structures. Evolving some of these relationships, I think machine learning has played an important role in terms of how we start to work on some of these things, and even very simple kind of decision-making, leaning systems, predator and prey relationships, or training becomes kind of important in terms of really trying to understand the relationships of how these kind of simple agents can start to take kind of decisions and what kind of emergent properties are. So the way of versioning and digital playpenning is an important way in terms of how we are working through some of these problematics. And then those, once again, in terms of more kind of larger scale populations, can be invested in terms of really working through population and generation, and to try to start to explore, I think, different ways of thinking about how these things are self-governing in some ways. Within the domain of some of the work that we're exploring, we're trying to find strategies of, in some sense, constructing even just a simple metabolism of how something is somehow operating in the world. This is particular prototype, which is really more of a kind of flying system. And the strategy of that is to try to self-regulate. But a lot of the things that we've been working on recently is trying to see if there are more intuitive ways of communicating that are not necessarily looking at top-down kind of strategies of command and control like early cybernetic models, and to try to see more kind of human strategies of also evolving those kind of relationships. So within gaming platforms, we've been working quite a lot in terms of not training in a one-way kind of approach, but really trying to evolve different ways that communication can be explored, either through brain-controlled interfaces or other forms of more gesture-related observation. The intention of that is to start to create the conditions where we can really prototype through installations these kind of relationships that we've been evolving through machine learning, to be able to develop prototypes that actually engage the world and engage us, one by acknowledging us and also evolving maybe more curious and playful ways of interaction. The last year, we've been also trying to consider maybe some of the current circumstances within a more disaster complexity scenario. And I think some of those issues are in some ways opportunities for us to see what the deployment of some of these logics could actually be for some of the problems, especially with all of the migratory aspects that we have of people that are displaced, aside from the kind of social political ways, natural disasters. And we look at systems, for example, like AutoStore or Kiva systems as kind of strategies to potentially look at how some of these kind of existing models of thinking of maybe more autonomous systems like port systems or air traffic control can be considered in different ways. So a lot of the research is trying to kind of understand this is how Kiva is kind of operating in Amazon warehouses and others, kind of deployments of this kind of system, and to try to understand the logic of the decision-making that is both localized and real-time, and to see how those things can basically afford us strategies to look at that. And that opens up, I think, interesting research strategies that include machine vision and other forms of seeing what situated kind of embedded intelligence within agents could actually operate and how they could somehow manifest their interactions with things. So a lot of the research in this case is continuing, I think, the last good 5 or 6 years of robotic development into strategies that are trying to evolve that into a system that could be packed and deployed. And the computational logic, for example, of what a sheltering system for post-disaster scenarios could be like, in terms of thinking about processes where the enabling of kind of more deployable characteristics is necessary, and to try to develop a strategy where those things can start to operate with more internal logics to make things much more context aware, and to take the aspects of the prototypical into a strategy where those things can already evolve kind of solution spaces, both computationally and within the deployment. And one of the aspects around these things is to kind of consider the fact that these kind of systems that are existing in the world at the moment, though designed to be very temporary, unfortunately become things that are very much permanent, and for reasons that obviously are much more complex than I can get into at this stage. But the reality of exploring some of this is to also understand that there is a limitation of infrastructure. So if we can consider architectural systems as embedded infrastructures, we could potentially kind of think about mobility systems and transformative or adaptive systems that are simple in some sense, combinatorial, but are also able to change. And the nature of change, I think, is primarily an interest of ours because of, I think, the aspect or the recognition of many things that we're designing for are uncertain and latent. And it's necessary in some ways to be in a position to be able to respond with those platforms. So other kinds of researchers have been looking at air control systems and the concept of dropping as self-actuation. And in this particular project, we've been exploring a lot of simulation-based ideas of more flight-controlled actuation. And this was developed obviously during the full-blown pandemic. So a lot of the concepts of prototyping was quite do-it-yourself at home kind of strategies to start to see how the simulations influence maybe some tests, basically throwing things outside of our flats, but also developing kind of strategies of thinking about how we observe landscapes, how we can use data streams to be able to start to understand ways of creating more analytical forms of computer vision and how that can influence strategies of how these kind of deployable architectures could actually operate in terms of localization, deployment, and then the aspects of internal deployments that would potentially radically change things on the ground as necessary. So these are kind of some speculative strategies, and one of our research teams was looking in particular to some of the issues around health and well-being, particularly looking at the issues to do with complexities of deployable systems that are usually looked at as interiors, and also the challenges of the hospital and these kind of aspects. And there was a recognition that a lot of the issues that people go to the hospital for, around 46% of that, could be potentially treated at home. So could there be a strategy to bring basically the hospital home and to use kind of automated systems in some ways, basically to deliver that care? So a lot of research went into really trying to understand how things are operated and to try to think about the distributed system that is an extension and augmenting the existing protocols within London. So basically speaking to a strategy of a decentralized hospital, which was an augmentation to the existing hospital and patient needs. So a lot of the aspects of this research was basically looking at how those kind of autonomous system with these kind of fixed resources could be deployed in different ways. So we quantified all of the machines and tried to think about using a gaming engine, really how we could develop maybe a way of extending these kind of mobile units that are existing and the machines that are actually embedded within them within a strategy almost like the Amazon warehouse of thinking about how these things could be deployed by basically more self-organizing and more combinatorial strategies of how these units could operate in the world. They took the form of units that were kind of monowheels, carriers of other units. And the idea was that these systems would be in the environment, almost like an Uber system or a Waze kind of system, continuously somehow being part of that. And to be able to look at scenarios where some things like vision and other systems could be very much part of the way that care is actually being explored, from every aspect, from robotic surgery to ideas of distributing actually medication and basic kind of monitoring. So this is more of a speculation of what an emergency response system would potentially be, and to try to find ways to kind of bypass obstacles of the city. So the idea of extending the hospital into the home is more a kind of concept that we were trying to problematize of how these systems would actually deal with some of the complexity of the challenges ahead. So I think with that, I think it's been important, the developments within the gaming industry, because I think that has helped us to really develop kind of modeling environments that allows us to explore and understand this, I think, in more profound ways. And I think the ability to do that, I think, allows us maybe different models of actually thinking about how we communicate some of these ideas beyond the concept of building in a traditional sense, to be able to kind of speak to the fact that architects, engineers, and designers, I think, can play a very active role in considering how they participate in a lot of the kind of emerging kind of challenges that we have in society. So I conclude with a kind of tried and tested kind of conceptualization of a lot of the things that potentially spawned a lot of the design computational strategies in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. When Cedric Price basically suggested that technology is the answer, but he reminded us very quickly that we have to really conceptualize in a more profound way what actually is the question. So at a moment when science fiction has become fact, I think it's important to potentially revisit some of these more kind of free-form kind of ways of thinking about these things, because they were profoundly asking basically how we somehow engage in some of the complexities of today, but seeing it maybe from the perspective of social responsibility and the demands of those aspects to the systems that we are developing. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to share some of the work with you, and I look forward to the remaining conference.
Theo, thank you very much for the amazing presentation. There's quite a lot of scope there and latitude of different ideas, different things. Would you take questions from the audience?
If there are questions, happy to take them.
Sure. I think the audience can use the question tool or the chat tool if you have any questions, or can raise your hands. I just keep an eye here if there are any questions. I do have a question, if I may. What is your view on the cognitive surplus of all of this? You know, because you have this distributed systems changing how we live and augmenting the options we have to deal with problems. But how does this feed into this idea that all of this become an enhancement for our collaboration and how we connect as a society and as communities? I think this is an interesting problem because we're not quite sure how to modulate people. We try, but we often get it wrong. So how do you think this is going to have an impact on our cognitive surplus as human beings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question. I can take it maybe from two very different perspectives. One, I think from experience, I think giving people agency and enabling them to influence things, I think is very important. And I think in many of our interventions that I've done with my brother, it's been very purposeful on our part to make it very accessible and understandable to people how they somehow engage, and to allow those processes, not only from the individual, but for the collective to somehow manifest themselves within the system. I think the challenge in developing systems and making them inclusive is making people very cognitive aware that they have an influence, and that influence also comes with a certain responsibility to see things outside of oneself and to see things, I think, slightly in a bigger picture. Because I think we do have a tendency of being quite habitual in terms of our habit-forming processes of how we engage in space. And so I think sometimes architecture and its capacity to potentially be more adaptive and to change starts to kind of give the opportunity for that to become more legible in society. If people understand that their everyday habits are informing that, then I think that they have the opportunity to also become more aware, self-aware. And that, I think, has an influence in developing systems if they're considered as frameworks. And I think the aspect of designing platforms, I think, is very important. But usually the ways that these things are stress tested are not really based on a kind of more evolving model. They're usually stress tested with a kind of strategy that meets usually criteria that is probably quite simplistic or makes certain basic assumptions about, the general public's contribution to something, or the metrics that are being used to evaluate it or to fund it. So I think that there needs to be scope for platforms to really make themselves meaningful by actually demonstrating that people, in some sense, have something at stake. At the moment, I think a lot of the metrics are very much based on some metrics which in some sense one could argue are quite trivial or make very basic assumptions about how we live online versus the complexities of everyday interactions. So I think if we can shift our tendencies more in terms of behavior, not in a reactive way, but in a way that we're learning from not only our environments, but from each other, I think that aspect of learning and maybe revisiting models of learning that was not trying to teach someone, but really trying to learn from each other in a more collaborative way, I think then we can move towards participatory models and better understandings of how we can deploy things. Use the post-disaster scenario in a moment where architecture in building practice as we know it obviously doesn't really engage that complexity when we don't have infrastructure, where immediacy of time is critical to certain things. So even just speculating on these things is, I think, in some sense, bringing that into the lab is an important aspect for a lot of the technologies that are being developed. But mostly in terms of a lot of these things are existing in the world, but maybe need to be hacked into different relationships of how they're deployed. So I just think that that has an important kind of cognitive relationship to things, because it's clear that change is important, but the way that we deal with change at the moment is usually very reactionary and against that. And so to problematize that and to make that more legible for people, I think, is to have them to be part of the process and not be just affected by technologies that are continuously mystified. So our attempts in some way is really to work on those problems, but also to influence, researchers that go out in the world into very different industries, which I think goes beyond, some aspect of thinking about architectural or engineering practice. And those opportunities, I think, are afforded today in a particular way. So I think it comes with a responsibility as much as the appropriation of tools.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree. I think economical models of value have a lot to learn from how we actually execute our design processes, our design thinking. I think there is a lot of alignment there to be created. Yeah, thank you very much. So there is Eduardo's comment here. Brilliant presentation. Just want to share a project that we are proud of, a modular hospital in Indonesia, etc. Yeah, Eduardo, thank you for the link. We will add this to the YouTube feed.
Yeah,
okay.
As well.
Yes. So if there are no other questions, I'm aware of the time. I just want to thank you, Theodore. Thank you again for the amazing, insightful presentation, for making the time to be here today.
It's a pleasure, and I think it's very important to engage each other and to really share what we're working on. I think we need to upgrade the game across the board if we're going to really respond to a lot of the urgent things. So I thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting me to also be part of the committee. So I look forward to see how the conference evolves.
Thank you so much. I'll see you in a minute. We'll come back to the same link in about 5 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your attention.